What's up guys, my name is Ace, and one of the additions to multiplayer in Modern Warfare 2 with Season 3 Reloaded was the throwing star. So today, I wanted to take a deep look at the throwing star, and we're just going to put it side by side with the throwing knife throughout this video. And diving right in, the first change that you'll likely notice with the throwing star versus the throwing knife is the damage. When it comes to the throwing knife, this deals at least 100 damage anywhere in the body, and therefore it's a one-hit kill no matter where it hits the enemy. Whereas with the throwing star, you probably notice it generally takes 2 hits to kill, and I went and tested the damage here, and it turns out you are dealing 90 damage with a single throwing star, so you are going to get them into super low health, or if you've already put a bullet into an enemy, for instance, throwing stars are excellent for just finishing them off. But it's also worth noting, if you can land a headshot with a throwing star, it will be dealing 100 plus damage, and therefore you can get a one hit to the head. Now, since there is this discrepancy in damage between throwing knives and throwing stars, it wouldn't make any sense to spawn with just one throwing star like we do with throwing knives. So it turns out by default, assuming we're not using resupply, you will spawn with just one throwing knife, whereas with throwing stars, you will by default spawn with 5 of these in your inventory. Additionally, when it comes to our default carry capacity, this is 2 with the throwing knife and 7 with the throwing star, and then for all of those values, you just add 1 if you're using the resupply perk. So you can carry up to 8 throwing stars or 3 throwing knives. Now, when it comes to replenishing these, it turns out with a throwing knife, you can just pick it up after you throw it. As long as you didn't throw it off the map, you can go and pick it up and use it again, whereas with throwing stars, you can't do this. Once you throw them, they're gone. There's no chance of recovering them. However, we can use the scavenger perk to replenish both throwing knives and throwing stars. And not only that, if you pick up a scavenger pack while using throwing stars, you will get 2 of them back rather than just the 1 that you would get back with a throwing knife. So if you are planning on really utilizing these throwing stars effectively, you'll probably want to use that scavenger perk. And then finally, with resupply, you will be able to replenish these every 25 seconds. You will get 1 throwing knife back or 1 throwing star back. Now, moving on to the next thing to look at that's really important between these, this is the trajectory, or how flat they will throw. How high above your target will you have to aim once you start stretching out the ranges? And it turns out with this, at 20 meters here, the throwing knife will drop quite a bit. So if you were wanting to hit a target at that range, you're going to have to be aiming pretty far above their head to be hitting them center mass. Whereas with the throwing star, it barely drops at all at 20 meters. So with this, you may want to be aiming a little bit higher up on the body, but honestly, you could put this right on their head and you would be hitting them roughly center mass at 20 meters. So there is a very big difference here between those two. And something that's obviously tied to that is going to be the throwing speed as well. And over the distance of 20 meters, our average velocity of the throwing knife is 38 meters per second. Whereas with the throwing star, this is roughly 80 meters per second, again, as an average over that 20 meter distance. So that's also going to play a huge role when it comes to leading a moving target. With a throwing knife, you're really going to have to be looking into the future and guessing where they're going to be, and that's where you have to throw it. Whereas with the throwing star, you don't have to lead your target nearly as much. Now, at this range, you would still have to lead them a little bit, but not nearly to the same degree as a throwing knife, and that will massively improve the consistency of your hits with throwing stars compared to throwing knives. But then finally, there's one other really important aspect to compare between these two, and this is how quickly can you actually perform the action of throwing these. Because with the throwing stars, we can actually throw multiple really quickly in quick succession, whereas with throwing knives, not so much because they're designed to be a one-hit kill. So let's just look at throwing one of these with an SMG in my hand. How long will it take to throw each of these? And you can already see in the side-by-side, the throwing star is going to be faster. But here's the actual data for you. The time it takes to release that from your hand to where at that point, even if you die, that's still going to be flying through the air and potentially getting a kill. With a throwing knife, this is 225 milliseconds, whereas with a throwing star, it's 200 milliseconds. So honestly, not a massive difference here. I was a bit surprised to see this. I thought you'd be able to get that throwing star out there very noticeably faster than the throwing knife, but really, it's not that big of a difference here when you're just throwing one of them. However, the big difference between these comes when we're throwing multiple. And as we can see here, this is a very big discrepancy between these two, which does make sense because, like I said, the throwing knife is designed to be a one-hit kill. You're not really meant to be throwing multiple of these in really quick succession, whereas you are meant to do that with the throwing star. And when we look at the numbers for this, it's going to take us about 1120 milliseconds to throw 2 throwing knives. That's from the moment you start throwing the first one to the moment the second one is released from your hand. Whereas with the throwing star, this is just 485 milliseconds, so significantly faster here. And I also wanted to include the fast hands data for you guys just below the standard data, just to show you that you can speed these values up, at least by a little bit if you are using the fast hands perk. But honestly, it's not a huge difference, and therefore I wouldn't say it's necessary to use fast hands if you're going for like a throwing knife or throwing star only sort of gameplay style. Instead, I would rather be using resupply at that point, because you'll spawn with an extra one, and you'll also be constantly replenishing them over time. Now, one last extra thing I just wanted to point out here is with both throwing stars and throwing knives, they will completely ignore trophy systems, so that is one benefit to using these over the other lethals in the game. And with that, that pretty much wraps it up for the main differences between the throwing knife and the throwing star. One big thing I wanted to point out from this data that I collected is if you're going for a 2-hit kill with a throwing star, which is going to be, I would say, the majority of your kills with these, since it is really hard to be hitting a headshot consistently, our time to kill potential is equal to the time it takes to release 2 of these, which is about 485 milliseconds. And when you compare that time to kill to the time to kill of the average gun in this game, that isn't even remotely close to being competitive. Now, I guess you could also argue you don't have to like aim down sight with a throwing star. So maybe if you factor in the time it takes to aim down sight plus kill with a gun compared to the throwing star, then it's a little bit more comparable there. But honestly, if you're using throwing stars as sort of like a primary weapon playstyle where you're using them specifically to get kills and you're consistently going for those 2-hit kills, I'm personally not a big fan of the throwing stars, and I would much rather have the consistency of just getting a 1-hit kill with a throwing knife, even if it is a bit harder to lead moving targets or to hit a target at longer ranges. And part of that is also due to the fact that when I throw a throwing knife, I can just go pick it up again and throw it again, whereas I can't do that with throwing stars. So if anything, since I feel like these throwing stars are a bit on the weaker side in relation to the throwing knife, I think there should be some chance of being able to recover throwing stars after throwing them. So one option would be maybe make it so you spawn with fewer throwing stars, but you're able to recover them. So maybe spawn with like 3 or 4 rather than 5, but any ones that you throw you can go pick up. Or maybe keep the standard 5 that you spawn with, but then make it a randomized odds of you being able to pick up that throwing star. So every time you throw one, you may or may not be able to pick it up, or maybe every second throwing star you throw or something like that, you'll have the opportunity to pick it up. I'm not too sure. I just feel like that's one area that they could target where it wouldn't significantly change the raw power or killing potential, but it would at least make the throwing stars a little bit more attractive when put side by side with a throwing knife, so you don't feel like you need to use scavenger every time you're using throwing stars. Having said that though, I don't feel like throwing stars are completely useless in their current state. I do think they have some utility in very specific situations. And the primary utility, I think, just comes from finishing off kills where you've already put some damage into the enemy player. Maybe you run out of ammo, or maybe you're using like a one-shot kill weapon and you get a hit marker, like a pump-action shotgun, or maybe you're trying to quick-scope or something. I think these would be great for just finishing off those kills when you get a hit marker with those guns, because you're going to be able to throw these significantly faster than swapping to a pistol and firing a shot, or faster than rechambering a round and firing another shot, for instance. Outside of that though, if you maybe choose between these two, I'm definitely going with a throwing knife any day of the week. Now, of course, these are just my thoughts and opinions on the throwing star versus the throwing knife in Modern Warfare 2, and this is where I want to hear from you guys in those comments down below. If you had to choose between these two lethals, which one would you go with in the game's current state, the throwing knife or the throwing star? If you enjoyed the video, a like rating is always appreciated, and don't forget to subscribe for more if you haven't already. I'll talk to you guys next time.